Have you ever stopped to think about how trillions of tiny individual cells can possibly build something as strong and complex as, well, you? I mean, how does your skin not just fall apart when you stretch it? Or how do all your heart cells know to beat at the exact same time? The answer, it turns out, is in this hidden secret world of cellular architecture. So today, let's explore this incredible world of cell junctions. Now, to really get a handle on this, we're going to use a simple analogy throughout this explainer. Just imagine that any tissue in your body, your skin, your gut, is like a big building made of cellular bricks. Well, the cell junctions are all the crucial bits that hold that building together and make it work. They are the sealant that makes it waterproof, the rivets that give it strength, the doorways that let things pass between rooms, and the wiring for high-speed communication. So here's our tour of this cellular construction site. First, we'll get a bird's-eye view of the whole cellular neighborhood. Then we'll zoom in on the sealant, which biologists call tight junctions. After that, we'll check out the structural anchors that provide all the strength, then the direct lines for communication, and finally, the really specialized wiring of the nervous system. Okay, first things first. Before we start looking at any one specific part, let's just get the lay of the land. We need to see how all these pieces fit together in a typical tissue, like the lining of your intestine. This image right here shows you just how incredibly busy one of these cellular bricks really is. You see, a cell isn't just floating around on its own. It is deeply, intricately connected to every neighbor and to the foundation it sits on. We can basically sort all these connections into four main jobs. There are occluding junctions that seal, anchoring junctions that bind things together, channel-forming junctions that let cells talk, and signal-relaying junctions that transmit messages. Let's start at the very top of our cellular building with the sealant. These are the occluding junctions, but you'll almost always hear them called tight junctions. Their whole job is to act like a gatekeeper, controlling what can and can't sneak through the spaces between our cells. So tight junctions form this perfect continuous seal, kind of like caulk around a bathtub, right around the top of these cells. This does two really important things. First, it stops molecules from just leaking between the cells. That's called the paracellular pathway. By blocking it, the cell basically forces everything to pass through it, which gives the cell total control. And second, it maintains something called cell polarity. It's like a tiny fence that keeps all the proteins that belong on the top surface separate from the proteins that belong on the bottom and sides. All right, let's pause and think about this for a second. In your small intestine, your cells are working super hard to absorb nutrients from your food and pump them into your body. So how do these tight junctions make sure all those precious nutrients don't just leak right back out into your intestine? Well, it's because they create that impenetrable seal we just talked about. They create a one-way street, forcing nutrients to go through the cells, not around them. Next up in our building, the rivets. These are the anchoring junctions, and their one and only job is to handle mechanical stress and hold tissues together with some serious strength. Seriously, without these, tissues that you stretch and pull all the time, like your skin and your heart, would literally just fall apart. Now, cells have two main ways of anchoring themselves. They can either rivet themselves directly to other cells, or they can rivet themselves down to the foundation underneath them, which is called the extracellular matrix. And the key thing to remember here is that different proteins do these two jobs. Adherens are for cell-to-cell connections, while integrins are for cell-to-matrix connections. Let's start with the cell-to-cell rivets. First, we have adherence junctions. These link up to the cell's actin skeleton, kind of forming this contractual belt that gives a whole sheet of cells its shape. Just picture cadherin proteins literally zipping heart muscle cells together so they can beat as one unit. Then you have desmosomes. These are like heavy-duty spot welds. They connect to the much tougher intermediate filaments, like keratin in your skin, and they provide just incredible resistance to pulling forces. It's no surprise they're everywhere in your skin. Let's just zoom in here on a healthy desmosome. You can actually see the cadherin proteins reaching out across the gap between two cells, latching onto each other. And inside each cell, they're anchored to this thick plaque, which itself is tied into a whole web of super strong keratin filaments. This system creates a continuous network of strength across the entire tissue. It's really amazing. But what happens if these rivets fail? Well, in a rare autoimmune disease called pemphigus, the body's own immune system makes a devastating mistake. It starts creating antibodies that specifically target and attack those cadherin proteins in the desmosomes. The rivets literally start to break apart. And the consequence, as this image tragically illustrates, is a total loss of adhesion between cells.
Once those rivets are gone, the skin cells are no longer held together tightly. The slightest bit of friction causes the layers of skin to separate, fluid fills the gaps, and that leads to these severe, painful blisters. It's a really powerful and unfortunate example of just how critical these anchoring junctions are for our bodies. Of course, it's not all about cell-to-cell connections. Cells also have to be anchored down firmly to their foundation, the extracellular matrix, and that's where focal adhesions and hemidesmosomes come into play. Focal adhesions connect the cell's actin skeleton to the matrix, and they're super important for things like cell movement. Hemidesmosomes, which literally means half desmosomes, link those same tough intermediate filaments to the matrix, anchoring a whole sheet of cells to its base layer. Okay, so our building is sealed, it's riveted together nice and strong, but a building without any doors is pretty useless, right? Cells need to communicate directly with their neighbors, and that brings us to our doorways, the channel-forming junctions. In animals, this job is done by gap junctions. And here's how they're built. It all starts with individual proteins called connexins. 6 of these guys get together in the membrane of one cell and form a half channel, called a connexin. Then, when a connexin in one cell lines up perfectly with a connexin in the cell next door, they dock together, and poof, you have a complete open channel connecting the two cells. These tiny little pores allow small molecules, ions, and electrical signals to zip directly from one cell's cytoplasm right into the next. This is how all your heart cells manage to contract in perfect synchrony, or how a wave of calcium can spread like a ripple through a tissue, coordinating everything. Now, plants have to solve the same problem, but they do it a bit differently because of their rigid cell walls. They use these much larger continuous channels called plasmodesmata, which directly connect the cytoplasm of neighboring cells. All right, we finally arrived at the most specialized connection of them all, our building's high-speed data cables. This is the wiring of our nervous system, the signal-relaying junction that we call the synapse. Now, unlike a gap junction, a chemical synapse isn't a direct physical connection. Instead, when an electrical signal zips down a neuron and reaches the end, it triggers these little bubbles filled with chemicals, we call them neurotransmitters, to merge with the cell membrane. These chemicals get dumped into this tiny gap, the synaptic cleft, and they float across to bind to receptors on the next cell, passing the signal along. It is an unbelievably fast and precise way to send a message. So let's wrap this all up. We've got our 4 main types of junctions, and each one fits perfectly into our building analogy. The occluding junctions, they're the sealant, making selective barriers. The anchoring junctions, those are the rivets, giving tissues their strength. The channel-forming junctions are the doorways, allowing direct communication. And finally, the signal-relaying junctions are the high-speed wiring for our nervous system. And that brings me to one last thing to think about. We are now in an age where scientists can actually 3D print living tissues, and maybe soon entire organs. But the biggest challenge they face isn't just printing the cells themselves. It's figuring out how to get those cells to build this incredibly complex, functional architecture of sealants and rivets and doorways and wiring. If that was your job, where would you even start? It really shows you that understanding these junctions is understanding how to build life itself.